Now. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the NTU Hate Crime Research Seminar. My name is Irene Zempi. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the lead of the NTU Hate Crime Research Group and also a committee member of the BSc Hate Crime Network. This is actually the first research seminar for this academic year of the Hate Crime Research Group. I am excited to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Angela Charles, a senior lecturer in the Criminology department at Northampton University, who will present a paper on Black women in prison and the pains of impression management. Angela has recently completed her PhD entitled Black Women in Prison, exploring the intersection of race and gender in experiences of imprisonment. And on Saturday is the graduation, which is fantastic news. Congratulations, Angela. Angela has worked within the criminal justice sector in a secure training center, the National Probation Service, and also youth justice. So a really fascinating background in terms of also practitioner experience. Angela research interests are within prisons and penology and race and also gender. And her most recent research explored and analyzed the experiences of Black women in English prisons, paying particular attention to the intersections of race, class, and gender. Indeed, Black women are at the margins of society and face multiple intersecting oppressions. The prison is arguably a microcosm of society and perpetuates the same oppressive structural inequalities. And it is often these racialized and gendered pains of imprisonment that are rarely discussed or mentioned, even mentioned both within scholarly literature, but also the public realm more widely. The presentation will last about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have around 20 minutes for your questions, your thoughts, your reflections. And the presentation is also being recorded, and then it will be shared via the BSc Hate Crime Network YouTube channel. The Q&A will not be recorded, so it's only the actual presentation by Angela. I will now hand over to Angela.
Perfect. Thank you so much for a lovely introduction. So I'm going to go straight into it just so there is enough time for any questions. And also, at the end, if you have questions, but if you have thoughts or just kind of reflections, I also welcome those as well, because I find those really useful and interesting. So if you don't have a particular question but have a thought, then yeah, please do. So I would just highlight briefly what the presentation is going to go through. I'll try and go through it in a bit of detail, but also keeping an eye on time. So I'm briefly just going to talk about the pains of imprisonment, very brief to kind of set it up. And then I'm going to move into a longer discussion about impression management, looking at some of the previous definitions that scholars have come up with previously, before then applying it specifically to Black women and their experiences in prison. And then that's when I'll focus in on my research. I've made the presentation quite kind of quote heavy, because I really think it's important that the women's voices speak for themselves. So where that is the case, I'll kind of give you a bit of time to look through some of the quotes. I'll mention some of the parts of what they're saying, but not read it word for word, so you can kind of look through the quotes that are there, and then I'll explain them in more detail. And then lastly, going to finish off with a case study of one of the women that I spoke to in a bit of length for an interview, but was also part of the focus group. And the way in which she dealt with her time in prison, I just thought was really interesting in a novel way. of dealing with her imprisonment. And then hopefully at the end, I'll just briefly show some identity trees that the women conducted or created as part of the focus group that I did with them, which I think are quite poignant and a useful way or different kind of visual way of capitalizing data. So we all know, what the pains of imprisonment are, and it's not a new topic. It's been something that's been discussed for, quite a long time now. At the very heart of it, it's that loss of freedom and liberty. But if we try and take a more gendered approach to that, we start to think about the impact of imprisonment on mothers. Um, so the fact that they are, leaving behind children the first time they have been away from their children for that extent of time um, is, something that's quite painful for them. Um, so some of the women that I talked to that were mothers described this kind of double-edged sword of seeing their children at visits and then watching them leave. The despair of missing those key moments and milestones, and also sharing the joy that they had of being able to kind of do those small mundane things when they got to see their children, for example, on release on temporary license. So being able to go home for a day or the weekend and doing the mundane things like, helping their children with their homework, bathing their children, those things that we kind of take for granted. Um, we also know the detrimental effects of imprisonment on children as well, in terms of their upbringing, the kind of uprooting that it causes for these children. So that's another kind of aspect that I think isn't always thought about. And then lastly, historical traumas resurface, and the prison tends to kind of bring out some of those traumas for a lot of individuals. And the women that I spoke to had to deal with that alongside. Alongside dealing with these new traumas of being in a prison environment. So I just want to talk a little bit about the kind of systemic racism and disadvantage that some of the Black women that I interviewed faced, because it does occur and it affects some you know, uh, Black individuals. And that's not to say that it affects them all the same. The extent does vary, but it's important to discuss them. And the points that I am making are based on my own findings, as well as some of the previous research on prisons as well. So, experience of the criminal justice system. So, the first thing to note there is that um, many Black or ethnic minority prisoners enter the prison already feeling like they've been failed by the system. And this could be due to interactions during their arrest with police. It could be the court process, feeling like they've been treated more harshly, feeling like they've been given a harsher sentence compared to other women. Um, Now, of course, there could be other variables, mitigating and aggravating factors, but the point is that they enter the prison feeling aggrieved already, and this doesn't set them up well for reform or rehabilitation, supposedly, or positive interactions with prison staff. So within the prisons that I researched, there was also a lack of diversity. So the closed prison had some staff members from ethnic minority groups, so that was beneficial. But the open prison didn't have any staff from ethnic minority groups. Um, and that showed in terms of the cultural differences, preparing for Black History Month events and posters. And I should highlight that in the open prison, they didn't really know what to do for what to include on the Black History Month poster. I mean, it was quite sort of telling. Um, Also, in the examples that some of the women shared with me, they highlighted that staff were kind of dubious about their release on temporary license. So one woman wanted to go be released on temporary license to get her hair done, and stated that it would take 4 to 5 hours, which prison staff didn't believe. But that is a timescale that is quite common for Black women with natural hair or those seeking a kind of braided hairstyle. So it shows a lack of understanding there. Um, there's also systemic disadvantage found in the kind of lack of hair and skincare products for Black women. So there was an extensive Avon catalogue that catered more towards European hair. Um, and the catalogue that was specifically for Black women or ethnic minorities, so called PACs. It was very confusing in terms of when to order, what was in stock, the items that were available were minimal, and they didn't always fit the purpose. So we can see this complete binary between what was available for white women and what was available for Black women. Um, so systemic racism and disadvantage really manifests itself in numerous ways within the prison, and those are just a few examples. Um, there are also examples of microaggressions as well. So Black women described interactions with certain members of staff, saying that they felt uncomfortable to ask them for things, uncomfortable to ask for updates on processes like their rottles. And they stressed that staff were unhelpful and unpleasant to speak to, and they believed that that was because of their ethnicity. They also described feeling misunderstood, um, seen as aggressive, um, whereas they argued that individuals from other ethnic groups were able to be aggressive and show their frustrations, and they wouldn't be apprehended to the same extent. And that really links to previous research in this area. So scholars such as Angela Devlin, Ruth Chigwada Bailey, in which they state that Black women were seen as strong fighters, troublemakers, and aggressive in prison. So their voices are misinterpreted as problematic and aggressive rather than looking at the kind of cultural differences. And because of those stereotypes, Black women are denied the possibility to be vulnerable, the possibility to disclose mental health um, concerns or emotional issues and get the support that they should be receiving from staff. They also faced elements of racist victimization, such as withdrawn privileges. So previous research has highlighted these things, and my research, decades later, is showing that it's still the same thing. So one woman talked about her neighbor, so in her cell, who was in for the same sort of crime. She said that she did 6 months in closed conditions and then went to an open prison, whereas the Black woman had to wait 11 months. So she believed that race played a role. She went on to say, if your face fits, you get to move on quicker. And this was something that was mentioned by other women as well. So another woman that I spoke to said, when they want to rush people through the process, they can do. But it wasn't that case for Black women specifically. So these are examples of problems that Black women were facing with the processes, as well as interactions with staff. So just to move on to impression management now, and I've got a couple of definitions that you can see on the slide that I think are useful. So Goffman talks about impression management as this conscious decision to conceal or alter parts of the self or certain characteristics whilst revealing other parts of the self. And this is to promote a particular persona or personality. And this has been furthered by other academics. So Leary in 2019 talks about impression management as a process of engaging in impression management as a way of trying to control the ways in which you are perceived by others. And that's important because that's what many of the Black women were using as a tool within prison. So they are trying to create this self-presentation towards prison officers to be viewed in a positive light, and therefore, hopefully get the same sort of resources and access that other women did. Um, So I'm going to move on to talking briefly about some of the ways in which impression management was used by Black women in my research. So the first area was small talk. Um, so this was used with interactions with staff. Many of the women engaged in small talk to appear as if they were kind of cordial with prison staff and not appear to look as if they were kind of standoffish or so they didn't appear as a threat. So Maria says we have common conversations, but she doesn't sit down and talk about her problems. Um, then the next quote, which I think is really interesting one, Tracy goes on to say, you know, I have a good relationship with staff. I know what time of day it is. My motto in life is, it's your world, just leave me alone. So she's realizing that you've just got to kind of work with the system and make sure you're acting in a certain way that's not going to get you into trouble. And her comments highlight numerous kind of points there, really. Um, so the first point is that she believes that her relationships with staff are good for the kind of most part. She says they're okay. But secondly, she said, you know, it's telling us that she believes they're good because she's aware of the prison system and the compliance that the prison staff want from her. And that's the reason why the relationship is deemed as good, because she's playing towards what they want from her. And thirdly, she's willing to kind of cooperate and work with the system, display those levels of compliance that the prison is expecting, because she knows she's in their environment, they hold the power. Um, and even when prison officers will try to test her compliance through various means, she still has to keep up that level of self-presentation, that impression management. Another example is letting injustices go. So a lot of the women that I spoke to, you know, they couldn't challenge things as much as they would like to. Um, so Rachel says some people think that if officers say something, you have to have the last word. You don't have to just let it go. So that's an example of having to let the way that they're being spoken to, or some of these injustices just go. So Natasha, who was verbally abused by another prisoner, was told by prison staff that yes, you'll get a priority 2 bed, so you'll be moved. So she said they guaranteed her this, but it didn't happen. And she just said, it's fine, I've got my lovely bed when I get home. You know, but it's the fact that they guaranteed her that, and she was going through so much hell, and then they didn't follow through with that, and she had to kind of just let that go to not appear as being kind of problematic herself. Um, and then she goes on to say that she's not doing it. She's not going to let those people, so prison staff, get to her and stress her out, and that she just has to sort of rise above it. So those are just a few brief examples of some of the kind of ways in which Black women have to use impression management to get through different interactions within the prison environment. But this is a painful process. It's not a process that's easy for these women. It's sacrifices that they actually, you know, have to make. Um, so from having to, you know, have to hold back and not be able to speak their minds against these injustices that were happening, it was quite problematic. Um, so some of the quotes that were mentioned in the previous slide, you know, they highlight some of the painful parts of impression management. This adopted persona that you have to stick with regardless of what you're going through. And some of the women were able to adopt this unwavering kind of strong impression management that displayed compliance throughout and regardless of the situation. Um, but for some, it was quite difficult for them to continually take. So a woman called Crazy Eyes, and she came up with this with that pseudonym name herself, I should mention. So part of the focus groups, I got them to choose their own pseudonyms, and that was the one that she'd chosen. Um, So she talks about how staff hold up your progression, your reintegration back into society. And again, impression management has to be used to deal with this and not appear to be aggressive and a troublemaker. So she says they hold you back, but she just has to, keep stum. And she says, she's in their playground, so what's the point in kicking off? But it was a difficult and painful process for these women to go through. Um, so Crazy Eyes then goes on to talk about how engaging in impression management started to kind of change her internally. She talks about how it changes her, who she is as a person, and that it might be good in the way that she is learning these skills to be composed in these difficult environments. But then it's also that she shouldn't have to be around those people and be put in those situations in the first place. So it has its negatives to it as well. Um, and these quotes highlight some important issues. So one issue is that Black women feel like, they were also letting down fellow Black women by not speaking their mind about some of these injustices that were happening and due to the lack of action. So Marianne, who we'll look at later in more detail, describes it as potentially, colluding with staff members because she's not challenged what they're saying. So her comments highlight that there is a level of guilt that comes with keeping quiet for the sake of getting through their own individual prison experience. And another issue is that Crazy Eyes has adapted her kind of mannerisms and her responses in order to get through the prison experience with minimal conflict, um, so that she's not viewed as aggressive. But it's been internalized now, and now she's had to kind of alter parts of herself, quieten certain responses and reactions, and it's changed her as a person. Um, Another area that was important for my research was this idea of losing their colour or disculturation. Um, so Crazy Eyes admits that she had to alter her kind of behaviour to get by in what she calls, the prison officers' playground, but she does frown upon it for other women doing that. So she talks about, other women coming into the prison and spending lots of time with white prisoners and not spending time with other Black women. And saying that these women have lost themselves, so they prefer to not be with other Black women. Um, so she talks about it in that particular way. But then on the other hand, we've got Erica, who talks about it from a more, I guess, sympathetic and understanding way. And she says, a lot of Black girls feel lost in the system, and they're surrounded by, not a lot of people that are like them. So when they feel like they've got to fit in, they have to feel like they will fit this particular mold within the prison. So the first comment by Crazy Eyes highlights that if you're the kind of right ethnicity or race, you can get by more so than others. Um, but as a Black woman, you don't have that. You can't change your ethnicity. Um, so because of that, she alludes to the fact that Black women will instead change their mannerisms, alter their behaviour to try and fit in with other white prisoners to minimise that discrimination from staff. And what she's describing is this kind of form of impression management used by some Black women. And that differs from existing literature that looks at impression management, that's looked at it in terms of a performance, but hasn't really looked into the aspect of race and gender. Um, so they're adopting these forms of impression management as a way of reducing being seen as aggressive, loud, or troublemakers. So they've created this alternative identity to be seen as more desirable by staff. And scholars such as Harvey and Drake have discussed, this this idea of disculturation or role stripping, where an individual's kind of complex and multifaceted personality has to become very linear to fit in with the prison organisation. So for some Black women, they're presenting so far away from their what is seen as kind of Black stereotypes, and they're trying to present themselves as so kind of uh, you know they're trying to present themselves in such a different way than what they want to try and fit in with what the prison is expecting from them. And this means a move away from anything that kind of associates with their ethnic or cultural heritage as a Black individual, and an adoption of a more Eurocentric self that fits in with the prison organisation. So when Crazy Eyes is talking about how these individuals have forgotten about their roots, their Blackness, when instead what might be occurring is that these women are adopting impression management practices to create this new persona that is accepted within the prison environment. So I just want to briefly talk about resilience. So all the points that I've mentioned beforehand highlight the painful experiences of some Black women in prison. And they have to adopt coping strategies and methods in order to get through their imprisonment. So one key area that was really important for some of the women was family. So as I said, I'm not going to go through all of the quotes word for word, but you can have a look through. But what is clear here is that having contact from particular family members to help them through their situation and provide this source of resilience. In some cases, it would be, parents that would help them and support them through. But in other cases, it would be the fact that they have their children at home and trying to improve their own lifestyle so that when they are released, they can go back to their children as a new kind of a more improved individual. So one woman talks about calling her family on a regular basis, having to call them every day, and that acts as a supporting factor to her. But the costs of that are problematic if we think about how expensive, phone calls are within the prison environment, and having to constantly put money on her phone and get that credit. But she needed that in order to have that family support. So those comments highlight the importance of family, but also how contact is governed by finances and access to funds. Previous research has shown that Black women, in many cases, are one of the groups earning the least amount of money before their incarceration, which demonstrates the difficulties of being able to have those funds to keep up regular contact whilst they are imprisoned. And this also shows this intersection between race, gender, and class, and those interlocking oppressions. So Black women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds that are struggling and face those inequalities in employment prior to prison, which then makes it difficult to pay for things in prison, such as telephone calls, hair care products, and all of those factors. But they make those sacrifices in order to be able to communicate with their children, with their parents, and keep and maintain those relationships. So those are just a few additional quotes that highlight the importance of family, really. So Marianne talks about not feeling like a mum while she was in prison, but now being released on temporary license and getting to do some of those things with her child. She feels like it's sort of coming back to her. Um, Another lady, Erica, talks about having her kids visiting her was a good strength of support. She doesn't like having to say goodbye to them. She doesn't want them, necessarily being in that prison environment, but it's important for her to see them. And that's what gets her through. So those were the kind of external. And then I looked towards some of the more internal methods that some of the women adopted to try and stay or be resilient, really. So there were several resources that they drew on within their own sort of mindset that served them well to try and navigate the imprisonment experience. Um, so not letting things get to them, having to let things go. So many of the women that I interviewed talked about the importance of not letting things get to them, being their own driver of their responses and their experiences. So you can see Deborah says that she doesn't let anything affect her while she's there. She just has to get on with it. The point by Tracy, which I think is really poignant. My motto is that it is what it is. It's not my world. I'm just living it. So realizing that she doesn't have that control within the prison environment, she's living in their kind of world. Um, so they acknowledge they don't have the power to change, the length of sentence, and instead they shift their focus to areas that they might be able to control. So their responses to things, their reactions to situations and interactions. Another woman, Alice, had a similar kind of opinion to Deborah and Tracy, but also acknowledged that being able to let go doesn't happen instantly. It's a process of accepting that lack of power, calming her mind to that realization, and then conforming with the prison rules. Um, Another quote, one by quite a young prisoner called Charlene. So she says, "We can't hide it. It's just there. It alters almost every kind of personal transaction you have with an individual who's not Black, just the fact that it's there. So it alters how they deal with it. So she says, I need to know as a person, I'm personally fine with that. I can cope with any type of transaction because I don't feel like I'm in any way less of a person. Um, so I thought that was quite a interesting and an important kind of point that she was vocalizing there. Um, and quite a few of these comments, I think, link to what Coretta Phillips has talked about previously, this notion of fatalistic acceptance, where ethnic minority prisoners accept the racial discrimination will occur, that they will have these discriminatory interactions, um, and they kind of accept it. It becomes normalized and accepted. And that was the case with a lot of the women in my research study. Um, and Phillips also claims that these kind of racialized interactions are accepted and normalized because it's an extension of what happens in society. It's the inequalities that they already face in society. Um, so she talks about it being an extension, of the treatment and inequalities that pollute the lived experiences of Black women in society. Um, but the women that I interviewed, a lot of them refused to dwell on those situations of what they couldn't change. Although they were unhappy with parts of prison processes and interactions, they tried to focus on specific goals and targets to improve themselves and work on what they could do. Um, just checking for time. Um, Again, I think this understanding that they were going to be, I guess, disadvantaged and that the prison processes and services were going to fail them, again, links to another research, another scholar called Mashonga, who found that, Black women are so used to formal services lacking kind of cultural competence that they don't even think to call on staff or challenge such practices because, again, it's something that's normalized. So a lot of these women were displaying that they were acutely aware of the lack of support, the lack of services for Black women, but they just put it aside and kind of got on with it because that's what they didn't expect any changes to happen. And it also links with this idea of learned hopelessness and helplessness that Black women are kind of forced to adopt when they're in contact with the criminal justice system. This complete lack of power, and being at the mercy of those that are yielding kind of control. So I could go on, but I just want to kind of conclude with the case study briefly, and then also just highlight a couple of the identity trees. So as I mentioned, Mary Ann was one of the women that I spoke to in quite a lot of detail. She was in the open prison, and she'd just started going out on release on temporary licenses and got to see her son. She was in her late 40s, and had around 12 to 18 months left of her sentence. So she talked about being surrounded by good people. She even changed her room. So she was in what was seen as kind of one of the best rooms in the open prison, but she changed it because she wanted to be in a better mindset and around other people that had a more positive energy. She also talked about focusing on the now, making the most of what she's got, not focusing on the end, not saying I'm going to be happy when I get to the end of my sentence, I'm going to be okay when this has happened, but talking about being in the moment, what can she do in that particular moment? Um, so I thought that was an interesting way, because we constantly hear, women or prisoners in general talking about when they're released, this is going to happen, and looking at that end date. Whereas for her, she was really focusing on what can I do in the now, because if you put so much pressure on that end point, it can, she argued, could be kind of disappointing. Um, but there were also times where she struggled mentally as well. So she discussed how she coped during those moments. So she talked about writing down in a book when she felt really low. She would write to herself saying, just remember, tomorrow's a different day. It's not a permanent state. It will shift. It will move. She talks about writing that, it might not move as high up as you want, but it's going to move. And then looking back at that in a few days' time or a week later, she was proud of herself being able to see, I wrote that in that moment of turmoil. So I thought that was quite a powerful kind of discussion that I had with her. And she also talks about reflecting as well, on the time and space that she has, working on historical traumas that she faced from being in care. And then lastly, she talks about creating these pockets of autonomy as a means of coping. And this ranged from getting out of her cell on her own accord, so that it wasn't prison officers telling her, right, you need to leave your room now, being out with nature, and also the freedom that that kind of created. So trying to create those pockets of autonomy. That has been described by other academics, such as Ben Crew, as these kind of acts of personal power, whereby these acts would normally be deemed as kind of trivial to us, such as going into your cell before being told, but it actually created a important sense of agency for some of these individuals in prison, and particularly for Mary Ann. So just to conclude, I wanted to show a couple of identity trees. Um, so as a kind of bit of background, I'll put one up as I discuss. Hopefully you can see that a little bit. But I got them to think about key events that were important in their lives, stemming from childhood right up until the kind of moment. So those lower down on the tree, in the tree trunk, were childhood experiences. So this one talks about hair struggles, issues at school, making friends. And as they go up into the tree, these are more kind of adult experiences. This one doesn't have leaves, but in other examples, people added leaves, which would include their kind of hopes for the future. So you can see there are different kind of examples here of some of the things that this lady, Crazy Eyes, faced. So this one does show those additional points. If you look kind of to the far end of the trees, um, it it highlights some of the kind of successes and hopes for the future. And then lastly, as you can see towards the end of each of these trees, there's a little kind of circle with words in it. And this was what I asked them to create, a little compost heap of things that they no longer wanted to be defined or labeled by. That they had experienced in their lives before. So this lady put aggression, so she didn't want to be seen as aggressive anymore. The previous one talks about, it's a bit blurred, didn't want to be labelled based on kind of her figure and how she looked. And the final one, she didn't want to be labelled in terms of being seen as having an attitude problem, and also being classed as kind of stuck up because she was mixed heritage, and had experiences of that before, where people kind of felt like she was looking down on them. So this was a really kind of important and a visual aspect of getting them to think about key experiences, events in their lives that shaped who they were as Black women. So I just wanted to kind of conclude by showing that. Yeah, and I'll take any questions or thoughts. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Angela, for such a fascinating presentation. And I also loved the creative methods used here. Let me quickly stop recording so that we can open up the floor for